stream is live. There we are.
Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm joined today by Kruptos to discuss Jacques Ellul. Now, before we sort of get into the meat of it, I'll briefly explain how I discovered Jacques Ellul. So, Jacques Ellul is famous for two things, a sort of systematic critique or investigation of the technological system itself, and also his Christian anarchism work. Now, I was made aware of Ellul from the Christian anarchism work. He wrote two books, Anarchism and Christianity and The Subverting of Christianity. And yeah, the Christian anarchist crowd has definitely some interesting people in it. But they introduced me to Ellul, and I kind of stayed at that level for a while. But then eventually I realized Ellul had this broader, more expansive critique of a technological society itself. And I started investigating some of his work. Now, I haven't read the entirety of the Technical Society, but I've read excerpts of it and seen other people give summaries of it. And I think it's a very interesting perspective. Now, I found your work, Kruptos, before your excellent interview with Orrin McIntyre, but that's sort of where I really got to see you lay out your interpretation of Ellul. So why don't you explain briefly how you found Ellul and why you think he's important with regards to analyzing technological society?
Yeah, well, I have had, thank you for having me on, first of all. And I found Ellul in college. So this would be back, I'm in my mid 50s now. So this would be back 30 years ago. And it was, again, mostly introduced in, philosophy of technology type sections and courses. So I had a professor who would give out bound short readings that he would select, and then from there a bibliography. And he said, really, we'll teach you things in the class here, but the real work is be done by you in terms of bibliography. So I ended up, when I was in grad school and seminary, there was they had a free book table there, believe it or not, and one of Ellul's works showed up on the free book table, his Technological Bluff, and I recognized it as one of the books that was on that recommended list from my previous philosophy professor. And so I snapped it up, took it home and devoured it. And my life was never really the same since. And so since then, I've read and reread a number of his books. The one that I still meaning to get to, but have not yet, is Anarchy and Christianity, or Christianity and Anarchy, which I hear is very good. But a very different sort of political vision, which after you've read a lot of Ellul's other stuff, I think does kind of make sense. So I have read now the Technological Bluff, the Technological Society, his book, Money and Power. And there's one on the Christian life that I can't remember the title of right now. And then also his book on violence. And then The Political Illusion, and and of course, never forget, that is actually the first book I was introduced to by this professor, was Propaganda on the Formation of Men's Minds. Mm-hmm. And then after, and the political, those three books, the translator and the guy who did the introduction to The Political Illusion says that the Technological Society, Propaganda, and Political Illusion form like a triptych, trilogy. And that gets at, in many ways, the core of Ellul's theory. And then I recently read Augusta, the book that Carlo Lancelotti translated. It's a collection, so it was never really existed in Italian as a book. But the collection that Carlo Lancelotti translated, The Crisis of Modernity. And in The Crisis of Modernity, Augusto Del Noce several times quotes very favorably Autopsy of a Revolution. So I thought, well, I better pick that up recently. And so that was my most recent Ellul, was Autopsy of Revolution. And then partly from that, and partly there's a Twitter mutual, as I explained on the thing too, that's how I ended up on Orrin. And we had been sort of, just basically, so we don't keep having the same discussion again and again. why don't you just once and for all make the case of why elite replacement theory is not going to work? And so I use an Ellulian vision to just sort of lay out, the nature of the technological state, and, drawing in pieces from the technological society, the political illusion, and then also from propaganda and Autopsy of a Revolution. Oh, and then even violence somewhat too as well, to lay out a vision of why really the elite replacement theory, at least within the system of the administrative state, just really doesn't work. And then pulling in a few insights from, say, a thinker like Marshall McLuhan, who once you've read Ellul, McLuhan adds a few finishing pieces that really, help juice what Ellul is doing.
Yeah. Now, as to the segue from a critique of technology to anarchism, and more specifically Christian anarchism, it maybe isn't as strange as one might think. So
it isn't really, once you've dived into all those other books. The fact that he wrote a book, Christianity and Anarchy, or Christian Anarchy, really actually makes a lot of sense.
Right. Even someone who's not an anarchist and not a Christian, of all people, wow. Can't think of his name now. Brave New World.
Brave New World. Oh, yeah.
Just lost it.
Hobbes? No, not
Huxley.
Huxley. Yes. Huxley.
So in his 1946 preface to Brave New World, he says that the islands that the heroes are exiled to are actually the ideal place to live, as opposed to he doesn't use, Ellul might have been writing some obscure texts in the 40s, but of course Brave New World was written in 1935, I think. So yes. This is well before that. But the idea being that we live for he quotes Jesus when he says, the Sabbath was not made for man. Man was not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath for man. And Huxley has this very insightful perspective that, yes, modern society has inverted that we have, fallen into the trap of the Pharisees to make man in service of this other thing, which the islands are a place where that doesn't exist. And so, as adding further commentary on the book, he's saying, yeah, it's a kind of like mutualism, which I guess is a kind of anarchism when you think of it, Kropotkin. But so, I mean, again, totally unrelated to Ellul, but it's almost like the conclusion you come to after you reach this. And this is an atheist who's not even religious. And the other thing is this idea of, the technique itself. That's, the replacement theory. Yeah, it's not going to work because let's say the alt-right. Let's say we have we're going to use Marvel comic book logic here. We have another Earth where Mr. Mustache won. Mm-hmm. Europe would just be Japan. There wouldn't be immigrants, but there wouldn't be anybody.
Yeah, it's the idea of elite replacement theory is this, that the system is screwed up and bad. We have bad elites and terrible elites. What we need to do is train up some real elites of our own, go in, take over the whole system, and then impose a kind of based system with good laws and good policies. And once you understand the nature of the administrative system, that it doesn't really work that way, because, and this is why it's good to read Ellul, because it go back and historically speaking, it's good to see how the technological system grew up and how it is part and parcel with liberalism and the general ethos of liberal thinking. Like, we generally talk about Enlightenment liberalism, like modernity's three big ideologies, liberalism / with capitalism, and then Marxism and fascism. Now, liberalism and Marxism have largely merged now. And that was one of the things that Del Noce noted in Managerialism. And the other one, fascism, has largely been rendered out of bounds because it doesn't conform to the general. It's a past utopianism, so it doesn't conform to the general cultural notion of moving forward, right? And so Western society built around this idea of, progressive technological advancement and progressive scientific advancement is really at the heart of the whole Western project. So a number of things. So you have, you're using this idea of technique to create the means to demonstrate and prove scientific truths. You're expanding knowledge iteratively, sort of progressively. So you propose a thesis, you do an experiment, it doesn't quite work, so you bring back the data and you redo it and you redo it and you redo it, right? And you eventually gradually move forward. And the same thing with other academic knowledge. You have the same kind of, and you do the same thing with technology. So, knowledge, science, technology are all moving forward. And the two power things that the technical systems, and Ellul says, really, it's not the actual devices that matter, it's the way of thinking. And this technical, abstract, rational way of thinking that is, systems oriented and so forth, is really what unlocks the power of all of the rest. And it enables you to accumulate great amount of political power, but then also, perhaps more importantly, vast amounts of money at scale. And you can see this even in things like managerial books, right? How do you take your organization from a one-man startup to, a large corporation? And then at each level, you have to change your style of management. And what they're really documenting is, in the lifespan of an organization, basically what happened throughout history as, as technique allowed society to expand at scale, from the local communal up to the national and then the international and so forth. So people often don't see, and this is the thing that Ellul allows you really to see, that probably now the base Western ideology, I mean, we call it managerialism, but really the base ideology of our society right now is technique and technical thinking. That is our ideology. And so when you see it operating in a business meeting, because administrative systems in business look exactly as they do in government, look exactly as they do in NGOs. And really, when you think of the state apparatus, they all run on this same operating system, right? And, it's that thing that Curtis Yarvin calls the cathedral, right? And that's that dispersed network of managers throughout this system and across the whole system. So that's kind of, in a very, very short bit, how it works. I mean, we can dive certainly into it deeper, but that's why understanding Ellul is so important, because Ellul allows you to get past the Republicans and Democrats dialogue, the left and right dialogue, to really understand, what's happening at the level of kind of root myths and cultural movement.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things here. I don't know if you've seen any of my content before, but I've done a few videos on what I call the nemocracy. Nemo means nobody, so nobody's in charge. And what I mean by that is we live in a system of systems. So the global interconnected technique that Ellul predicted, casual, I just call capital M machine, as a kind of like shorthand.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the global interconnected technique, which is itself composed of nations and corporations, which they themselves are composed of systems. So it's like this monstrosity of systems, subsystems within a system. There are so many moving parts that nobody actually knows how they all work together, and nobody could. So what, in fact, that actually means, for those of us that are not spiritually inclined, nobody's in charge, because no human intellect could conceive of it all. If you are spiritually inclined, then I argue some malevolent supernatural forces behind it. And I would also recommend, if anybody hasn't seen it, my last discussion with Eric Jensen, a well-known critic of technology, we sort of delve into that idea.
Ellul has thoughts on that as well, too, in Autopsy of Revolution. And what Ellul argues, in a sense, is that as you enter into the revolutionary era, he makes the note that there have been revolts all throughout history. Right? So you would have oppression, you'd have an intolerable situation, it gets to be too much, and the people revolts, they cast down the unjust king, the lord, the business, whatever, right? They throw him down, it exhausts itself, it gets put down, or it gets co-opted, whatever. But what separates a revolution from a revolt is partly that the time in history in which it occurs just as the managers are beginning to ascend, the bourgeoisie managers. And so what happens in the revolution is that the grievances that spurred the revolt, right, they don't die out in the revolt. They instead are instantiated into policy and institutions via the managers, the managerial class. Now, at the time, this is an infant sort of thing, right? And so in this whole process, you have a period at the end of the religious wars where Christianity is waning. People are looking for a new way to do things that doesn't involve the passions isn't susceptible to the passions of religion. And so they latch on to reason and human reason, which ends up being a form of technical managerial control in its infancy. And they push Christianity into the private sphere. So that is basically, you're told, you as Christians, your faith is fine, but it's a thing of private satisfaction. In the public realm, we will do things by reason and reason alone. Now, there's various successes in managing that. The French went full rational state. Americans kind of had a mixed thing. But generally, this idea of a secular public space and a private, religion as a private satisfaction, this idea kind of took hold. As the managerial state grows and it becomes more, as it grows at scale, right? So nature abhors a vacuum, as they say, and all great societies organize themselves around a religious principle. Well, this new religious principle around which society was organizing itself was this idea of human progress, that we could instantiate utopia through our own efforts as human beings. And this idea of human progress, that we could progressively, step by step, improve ourselves and society to the point where we could enter into utopia, right? So that's that sort of great religious idea. But it also needs a kind of metaphysical reality. And what Ellul argues is that the technical administrative state takes on that metaphysical reality, right? So it defines meaning, order, purpose. All of these things are done in and through the administrative state. So in a sense, if it's a metaphysical reality, the administrative state has taken on the role of God in the Western society, right? And it has pushed the Christian God off to the side, which is why essentially, if we have an internal fight within Western culture, this is why I've argued that the post-Nietzschean type of I think is not going to, it's going to largely eventually be irrelevant, because really what you have is going to end up being a religious clash, right? Between those who follow the old Christian God and those who follow the new God of the state, right? And that's kind of where you end up with this sort of all-encompassing, and it comes back to Heidegger on technology, where we enframe ourselves, right? So this is this idea, within the technical administrative state, as they used to say, as Paul said in Romans, within his being, we live and move and breathe. How does it go? Within his being, we live and
breathe and have our own being. Yeah,
that's something like that. Yes, and now all of a sudden I was quoting it not too long ago, and now I've forgotten it. But you have a similar type of reality with the administrative state. Within it, we live and move and have our being, right? And that's sort of the reality of the day. So on the one hand, the state is both object of worship, but also, in a sense, the priestly class that occupy it, sort of create the means by which worship is offered up to the grand technical enterprise, right? And AI really represents the promise of the capstone of that, because it basically says that we, up until this time, we have lacked the power to fully manage everything, but finally AI will give us the power that we've lacked before to manage everything in minute detail on a real-time scale.
Well, it's
the
funny,
singularity, as they call it.
The Soviets had the same view. They called it cybernetics. they thought that cybernetics in the 80s could allow them to achieve the Soviet organized utopia.
That's actually the term that Ellul uses in the technological bluff, is cybernetics.
The other interesting thing here, the more I hear about this, it reminds me of something that Ivan Illich said in Rivers North of the Future. He gives this sort of commentary on the Good Samaritan, saying that as told by Jesus, it's this sort of relational thing where you know, one man, the Samaritan, relates to another man, the Jew, and Christian compassion and charity is done in this relational way. He argues that what ended up happening is that Christianity, as it developed over time, created this system where Good Samaritanism was enforced as a part of an imposed system, which he argues undercuts this relational quality that the passage has. And that seems to be, now this was like 2003, it was an interview which is later put down in a transcription. Seems like he's saying something kind of like what Ellul's saying about how this system has developed out of something organic and real, and then says, well, we're going to do that, but in a way that's completely abstracted.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. So you have to understand that, and this is important, that we as human beings have always been tool using, right? It's not like just magically with the technological age, suddenly we use, I mean, you know, people in the 1100 built magnificent cathedrals using hand tools, right? So it's not that we didn't use tools or weren't capable of using tools. And the Greeks, you know, sculpted beautiful sculptures out of marble, you know, using tools. The difference is that tool use was embedded in tradition. Now, Ellul argues that tradition is, in a sense, the first form of technique, but it's a technique that's organic, it's in memory, and it's lived within sort of a real community, right? So these techniques are passed on through tradition from person to person. They're learned in sort of an apprenticeship format, in community format, and you know they're tried and tested over time. So Ellul would argue that, you know, if a particular tool didn't suit the particular culture of a local community, it would be discarded, or you would find that one tool was used in one way here and another way there. And the thing that separated, in a sense, the modern world is that you had a few tools. And so you had things also like laws, which are a form of technology in some sense, but the laws were few and they were elastic, and they were they allowed a fair degree of judgment and wisdom and human agency, and they were applied to a multitude of situations. So your basic legal code could be held within the memory of the community, right? This is the way we do things here, including your tool use, right? So, and you had a high degree of agency. So you had also a certain degree of lumpiness, because if you had, you know, good people in charge, things would go great. But if you had idiots in charge, things would go poorly, right? And, you know, if you were, say, a lord and you wanted to put, say, somebody in charge of your stables, and so you'd have a stable master. Well, the stable master would be a commoner, but he would likely grow up learning the art of the stables from the ground up in the stables. So he would learn everything, the whole running of the stables. He would learn the animals. He would learn everything. And then, you know, the old stable master would pass on, and then he would be elevated to the stable master by the Lord. But now this man would be in charge, and he would have agency over the whole thing. So all of the techniques would be embodied within the manager, right? There would be no written policy manuals. And then he would begin the process of training the next, you know, group of those underneath him, right? And apprenticing them and so forth into this whole thing. And the whole of society basically worked this way. So even if you had written laws, they were largely based on shared, just the common laws of culture. So yes. What happens then is something like, say, like Taylorism, right? Is, you know, a consultant would come in and he would watch the stable master do his work, right? And then over a series of weeks or months, he would then break down everything that the stable master does, the whole organization, into a series of tasks. And then he would maybe go to 2 or 3 stable masters, and he would come up with sort of, a best practices for stable mastering, right? And then everyone now would have to conform to these best practices for stable mastering. And then it would turn out, hey, you didn't really need, people that grew up in things. You could just basically hire anybody. And then you could bring in, you could get rid of this, maybe the more expensive or whatever. And you could mass produce, and we see this in teaching, right? So you have everything now in teaching is related to teaching methods. And the idea is that you produce consistency of results, consistent outcomes, regardless of the person who's there. And the knowledge is no longer embedded in the person. The skill is no longer in the person. So it's not the person who is getting the most out of the tools through the use of his skill and his skill and ability. Rather, he's told how to do the tool, or he has a machine that does it for him, and he just merely operates the machine, right? So technique takes the skill out of it. And this is, I've argued, this is why in some sense we're becoming dumber and less skilled as we become more and more technical, because people have to do less and less because it's all basically mapped out for them, right? Yes. And that's really, and then you expand that, everything has a series of policies. And Ellul argues that in the end, the outcomes become irrelevant or nearly irrelevant, right? Because it's all about the process of iteration, because again, we're working towards the future, right? So, okay, if we have a bad result like COVID, all the policies are terrible. Well, nobody gets fired because they're all expected to go back to the drawing board and come up with a new set of policies that are going to be better than the last set of policies, right? And then hopefully as you keep iterating COVID policy or the next, pandemic policy, we'll eventually get to sort of pandemic utopia where we'll have true best practices and everybody will be happy.
Right? Real quick, just to jump in here, there was a documentary I watched, which itself was probably recorded in the 90s, of Ellul. And it opens up with, it's in French with subtitles, but it opens up with him saying that in a technical society, nobody's actually responsible for anything. He gives an example.
They aren't.
He gives an example of a dam breaking, and he says, well, whose fault is it? Is it the government's fault for building the dam? Is it the engineer's fault for building the dam? Is it the regulator's fault for not overseeing? Nobody's responsible.
No, they're not. And then it might be just, it comes down to, well, it's bad policy. So we need to work on our procedures. And if we get the procedures right, we will have no more dam problems.
Oh,
right? We won't have the dam failure again.
When I was in college.
So we have to work on, so you go back, so then you work on, you get back. So you work on your government approval process. You work on your engineering processes. You work on your construction processes. And you work on your managerial processes, right? So all across the thing, nobody's at fault, nobody's responsible. Whereas if, say, the stable master, all his animals died, you know what I mean? He finds his head on the chopping block and his family's probably destitute, right? He takes responsibility for it. It's done. You know what I mean? But that's in a sense the essence of really it's true. Nobody is responsible for anything. And that's why you think like, wow, COVID, no, nobody's going to get punished because that's not the nature of how the system works.
Yeah, your point about tools is really interesting, or rather how Ellul talks about using tools and technique, because this was, again, long after Ellul was, well, not long after, I think Ellul died like 2001. But Illich in Rivers North of the Future makes this wonderful distinction between tools, organon, distality, and systems. Everything from the dawn of human history till 1200, he identifies as organon, which Greek is for organ. The idea being that the tool and the user are a part of a unified organ. So in the same way that a hand is an organon, so is a hammer, so is a sword.
It's an organic whole.
Yeah. So an example might be a samurai film where it's like become one with the sword. The sword is not distinct from the samurai, right? Or the hammer is not distinct from the blacksmith. He argues for various reasons that in the 12th century, in medieval Europe, with some scholastic speculation, we get the idea of distality, where the telos is now in the tool itself, not the user. So the sword now is something that cuts regardless of who's using it. Good example is Ray from episode 7. Picks up a lightsaber, never had any training, just uses it. That's distality. And then we have systems, where now man is a subsystem within the machine, and he now is dependent upon the machine for his very own existence. And so there's this progression of a intellectual development with how men relate to tools, I think, has a very orthogonal relationship to Ellul.
It does. And the more that you see you see these realities, or authors talking about it, right? So, you'll read Heidegger, or you'll read Postman, or you'll read Mumford, or you read, say, Sam Francis, you read Burnham, and they all end up saying, or Illich, they all end up saying very similar things about the nature of technology, because once you get into examine it, the fundamental, they just kind of reveal themselves, like the nature of process and so forth. So there is often an awful lot of overlap between the various authors. And Ellul is good in a sense because, if you had to sort of say, if you're going to pick one guy to read on technology, is really work your way through the Technological Society and the Technological Bluff, and you'll probably be fine. That'll pretty much well serve you for most circumstances.
Okay, we've talked a lot about relational technique and relational systems versus the abstract systems we have now. One interesting idea that Ellul has, and this is actually, he must be referring to telephones, because he says a modem society. And I'm like, well, computers really weren't a thing yet, so he must be referring to telephones. But the idea is that a modem takes in one signal, converts it into something that another receiver can get. But humans are being transformed into the modem in order to get what we need. We need food, we need clothes, we need shelter. So we have to communicate that into a signal that the machine can read to give it to us. And in order to do that, we have to step into this process to say, okay, we have raw materials over here, we have a factory over here that needs them, and some guys in the middle sending those signals. And it puts you in this web of abstractions, which leaves you alienated, deracinated, and alone.
Yeah, and like the word that Heidegger uses is enframed, which I think is a good one. But Ellul argues that as the systems become more sophisticated, you become increasingly, as you say, alienated, but you become increasingly cut off from the physical world. So even say, machine use, right? So as the machine becomes more sophisticated, at first you might have an operator who actually handles the raw product, and the machine does all of the repetitive brute labor, right? But then as they become more sophisticated, maybe the operator is just reduced to feeding the items in the machine. And then more or less you develop a robot, right? And the robot feeds the materials into the machine, and the operator is now in a control room, completely removed from either the materials or the process of actually making anything. And his relationship to the whole manufacturing process is entirely abstract.
Yes, and this is what's interesting, right? The idea that we would even entertain the foolish idea that AI or a computer could be like a human is only because we've defined humanity down. We've been defining. See, humans are not good modems. We're not meant to be modems. So an AI would be a much better modem than a human. And then they're like, oh, well, it's a better human than a human. Well, no, we've just defined humanity down to being a modem.
Yeah, I mean, I've written on this and have some thoughts on the idea of AI and why it really will never happen. But that, I don't know whether that's germane to this discussion. But
I only brought that up because we've defined humanity down by treating humans as
we
modems.
have. Well, maybe just briefly, just to get into sort of my thoughts. I can do it pretty quickly, right? So the idea is that all persons have an essential nature that we would sort of the older idea of a human nature and a human personhood, right? So we have this thing about us that makes us unique, that cannot be sort of broken down into language or anything else in any other form other than its own self. It can be encountered, known, and basically we don't really know where thoughts come from, right? And if you read a book like, say, Vital Lies, Simple Truths, it's argued that a lot of the decisions that we make are made pre-consciously. And so there's a whole range of things that are happening in our minds outside of our own awareness and are not necessarily connected to the physical. At least we don't understand how they're connected to the physical, right? And so there's this idea that like we don't really understand where thoughts come from. They just arise, right? And then we think about the thoughts, but where did it come from? So we have this sort of veiled aspect of our own consciousness that is just, it's there and we don't understand it. But when you're looking at computer code, no matter how sophisticated, how complex, and no matter how huge the data sets are, it is always legible, right? So it is computer code. It's a hard machines. It's on the machines. It's all encoded language. It's all, zeros and ones, ons and offs. And if you wanted to go into, to dive into, it can all be read and it can all be understood. They talk about how things are spontaneously happening, whatever. And that's just basically anthropomorphizing the machines. It's just projection. Because when you look at it, all computer code remains fully, completely, 100% legible. So you're right. They're dumbing consciousness down to the level of machine because they don't want to really admit that they don't understand consciousness and how it arises, right? So, a machine will only do what you tell it to do. It's only as good as its programming. Every model is only as good as the data and the programming of the model.
Yes.
No matter how large.
Exactly. And now what's interesting here, again, with not that this is outside, of course, the scope of what Ellul wrote about, but it's important, I think, because it sort of explains the efficient cause of what this is. So there's a core group of writers in England in the early 20th century that write about what's called the technological dictatorship. C.S. Lewis and the Abolition of Man. He's probably the most famous. Most people would have read that. Bertrand Russell wrote 2 books on it, The Scientific Outlook and the Impact of Science on Society. H.G. Wells wrote 2 books. One was called The Open Conspiracy. The other one I forget. And all of them describe this technological system. They're going to sell it to you by outlawing war, right? That's what we're going to do. We're going to outlaw war with this thing. That's why it's good. We can't have another World War, guys. 1 and 2 were terrible. And it's a sort of like niche study that even like a lot of these people don't really talk about. But then what Ellul does, though, is he shows you how technology does control us and how then it's easy then to extrapolate from that how it would serve the interests of people higher up the food chain in constructing this.
Yes. Well, see, the thing is that there's always this argument now these days, right? Are we being run by, an elite secret cabal like the Illuminati, just for lack of a better term, the Illuminati or whatever, right? So you have this group of, the WEF, that they're controlling everything behind the scenes, pulling the strings, and or are we being run by sort of the system and the way it works, just reflexively doing what it does, right? And I would argue that it's more the latter, that it is the system just reflexively doing. Now, those on the top who are benefiting from the system don't really control it nearly as much as they think they do. And even somebody like Elon Musk, firing like 95% of the staff at Twitter, now finds himself rehiring a person who's, I forget the exact title, but a person who's basically in charge of, censoring discourse at Twitter. And then you're thinking like, well, I thought that's what you fired 95% of people to get rid of, right? But then you just, you hit hard reset, but he's not actually doing things differently. It's still a technical system, right? And you can run whole empires without using technical systems. That's what people don't really, we tend to think of like, well, how would you run an empire? Well, they ran multiple empires without technical systems. They had administration, right? They had bureaucrats, but they didn't really have the level of abstracted technical systems that we do. And there's a key difference that way, in that, in a sense, governors, administrators were personally responsible for the area of administration over which they were entrusted. And oftentimes with each new administrator, everything would change on how things were done.
Yeah. So what would you say to this? That at one point, right, when the technique is just getting off the ground and it's in its infancy and it's growing into adolescence and maturity, there were humans directing it and they had a lot of control. That's where you have like the middle of the 20th century, the idea the actual technocracy gets really big, but then it's sort of like as a Frankenstein that outgrows its master and then becomes its own thing. Well, what would you say to that as a history?
Well, it actually begins earlier in the French Revolution, right? And you can see it with Napoleon and the French following in the period following the initial French Revolution and the Napoleonic period were very intentional about systematizing everything, right? And we have to remember too that there was a great kind of cultural plasticity at the time. This is one of the things that Ellul latches onto. He gives, what was it, 5? So he argued that basically Christianity held in check both technology, science, and the making of money. And he argued, there was 3 basically. So Christianity condemned the love of money and luxury. So renunciation was seen as the spiritual idea. So attachment was seen as a hindrance to development of faith. So there was also eschatology, the understanding that Christ would return and bring an end to this world, and was more important. And this end of Christ coming was more important than the here and now. So we kind of did the best we could, but we knew that Christ was coming anyway. So we didn't have to, like, Jesus has already saved the world. So we don't need to, and we know he's coming back anyway. So we'll just do the best we can, right? We don't have to perfect technology. We don't have to perfect our governance systems because it doesn't really matter in the end because Christ is coming back. And finally, the question of, is it righteous was more important than, is it powerful or is it efficient? Will it make me money? Right. And so the changes that were introduced, what does he argue? There was 5. Okay, so he argues that there's a long incubation period of technical experience and gradual technical improvement that kind of primes the pump. So you have all these people working independently, sort of doing scientific learning, building new machines, coming up with new kind of systems of doing things. You can see this in the bourgeoisie class as they begin to flex. And there is a great population expansion. There's a suitable economic environment. There's a period of social plasticity, sort of, and this would be the end period, right at the end of the religious wars following the Reformation, and then it emerges sort of a clear technical intent. And this is sort of everything kind of comes together in sort of a great optimism, right? So you have this thing, and you could often, and this is like, let's say somebody like Spengler, he observes with the start of what we know as the West really begins around the year 2000. And that's why I think it was Illich, you said, sort of, saw the period sort of ending around 1200. So Spengler identified that period around 1000 as kind of the beginning of the West. So you see all of these ideas beginning, the gradual rationalization over time, and they reach their fruition. You first have the Protestant Reformation, printing press, and then from there you have the religious wars, and Protestantism gets society in some sense ready for materialism by getting rid of taking superstition, shall we say, out of it, rationalizes the Christian faith. And then from there, after the religious wars, the bourgeoisie merchant class finally, with liberal ideas and the dawn of sort of rationalism in that sense, you now have this very optimism that we as human beings, it all kind of comes together. And there's this great cultural movement that we can perfect ourselves, and it sort of takes off in earnest during the Enlightenment in the 1700s, and then gains real steam in the Industrial Revolution. And that's really where it takes, and you see both big government socialism and sort of big industry emerging right around the same time, using the same methods.
Right, but if we're gonna document the beginning of the rationalization of Christianity, I mean, wouldn't that be with the scholastics?
Yeah, and the scholastics are running sort of 1200, 1300s, right? And so that would be in the period, very early on in the West. So and these things take a long time, right? And so, a case could be made, really, that the West, as we know it, and let's take, say, Spengler's dating, or even like somebody like Illich notes something similar. If we take it roughly around the year 1000, when Christ failed to return at the year 1000, that creates a kind of shock culturally. Now, they may not have identified it as this was the shock, right? But now you're no longer looking for the eschaton, right? And so things begin to shift. You're discovering manuscripts. The Renaissance happens. The scholasticism. There's a rationalization of the Christian faith begins to happen, which then cements itself in the Protestant Reformation, and like sort of the great argument over theology. And then from there, it just really begins to take off. But you could argue that the West itself has been a battle again. The West has been trying to free itself from Christianity through its whole existence to become what it is. I've made that case, I think, in Twitter feed or Twitter threads a couple of times.
We can identify this change actually with, you brought up eschatology. We can identify one man as the cause of this change. Joachim of Fiora, who developed the 3 ages of the earth, which gives us the idea of a utopian future in the here and now, a kind of radical postmillennialism. So the first age is the Old Testament, the age of the Father. The second age is the age of Christ, which goes from Christ until 1260. And then from 1260 onward is the age of the Holy Spirit, where you tear down all boundaries. There's, this sort of like revolutionary drive to tear down all boundaries begins to get its impetus ideologically from Joachim of Fiora. And that also would motivate, for example, Jesuit support for the revolutions in Latin America in the early 19th century.
Yes. Yeah. And these types of, and you can see it also like in Protestantism, where you have the millennium happens after human beings basically bring us up to we participate.
Yeah.
Postmillennial. Yeah. And so we as Christians bring the world, we help God instantiate his kingdom. And then once we've kind of reached that final point, then the 1,000-year reign, of Christ will occur. And basically we head into the eschaton, but we are actively participating historically. So it allows the merging of, this kind of Hegelian spirit with Christianity, in a sense that we were, and then that gets welded to, managerialism, business, and it all kind of comes together. And that's, the social gospel movements in the early 20th century, flow from this as well.
Yes. So there's a lot. So we actually covered a lot here. So maybe we should just put a bookmark in it. But one thing I think, if you're interested for a future conversation, would be, at what point did Christianity embrace a level of technique, right, that sort of brought us to the point of crisis, which then led to modernity? Because we've talked about a lot of different possible starting points. I mentioned the particular reading of the Good Samaritan that Ivan Illich speaks to. I mentioned Joachim of Fiora. You've mentioned some takes from Ellul and others about the scholastics or the Reformation or someone after that. What it really seems like, though, is there's a continuum. And there's a continuum knock-on effect from a certain point onward, and it kind of gets worse over time.
Yeah, okay, like you could look back. Spengler points you back to the chivalric literature, right? So we talk about the roots of modern feminism, and he identifies the changes in Mariology, right, that occur shortly after the year 1000. And he documents sort of the difference between the prior form, like the prior understanding of Mariology, and the newer understanding of Mariology. And you can see within the chivalric literature, the Arthurian tales and others, this idea of a proto-feminism, which is interesting because a lot of folks who point backwards, return to the age of like knights and so, well, they point back to like the chivalry and chivalric arts and so forth too, and you realize like, no, that's still part of the West in that sense of that sort of post 1000. So we live within a lot of it's really, I think, hard to pin down, but you really start to see it, I think, begin to gain its full form. And I'm basically, in terms of my Christian faith, I'm Reformed, right? So you can kind of own it, which is, Calvinist, right? Dutch Calvinism.
Sure.
And Calvinism, and Ellul was a Calvinist as well too. And it's but one of the downsides of Calvinism, for all of the good that the theology does in terms of, I think, getting things right and so forth, one of the things that it didn't do was preserve the deep, intimate spirituality. So in a sense, there's an overemphasis on word, reason, and theology, and it downplays the sort of spookier, the mystical connection with God, right? And we've brought that forward today, in Christian, in a lot of Protestant Christianity today, where we talk about the head-heart split, right? Well, we've got to get, but really that just exacerbates it. So you just basically go from mind to emotion. Whereas the prior spirituals were actually talking about, going up the mountain, so to speak, metaphorically, and actually meeting with the being of God, right? You like Moses, you travel up the mountain and you encounter God face to face, so to speak. And really, what Calvinism does is it sort of pushes a lot of that, the wilder and superstitious side of what they called superstitions off to the side, and then rationalized the Christian faith and made it suitable for a materialist world. And so from Calvinism, then you're a very short step to deism, in which you have the watchmaker God, right? So Calvinism is still in its form, is still fairly mystical in a lot of ways. When you talk about its theology of the Lord's Supper, the theology of baptism and so forth. But you're a short step from Calvinism to deism, where God recedes, he's there, but he recedes into the background. He's the great watchmaker and kind of sets the world in motion. And most of us today embrace this kind of watchmaker idea, that God set the world in motion, set up all of his laws of creation, and now it all kinds of runs and hums. And so the big problem is overcoming this big gap between us and God through this kind of mechanicalized world that has been placed in between us, right? Whereas prior to this, God was very immediate and present. A really good author for understanding this would be, say, somebody like Mircea Eliade, The Myth of the Return, where Eliade walks through the various ways in which the pre-Christian, the Christian, and the post-Christian sort of understand their relationship to being and archetypes, right? And so for us in a material world, the world is basically dead. It has no meaning of its own, right? And we give the world meaning. And so this is where you also see like the rise of, say, hermeneutics, because all of a sudden now the Bible is a problem, and interpreting it is a problem, because it becomes a kind of dead thing that you have to make alive through hermeneutical methods, right? Whereas prior to this, everything was saturated with meaning. Everything was saturated with archetypes. And so you became who you were by living into the archetype. So a king is good because he lives into the archetype of the king. A farmer is good because he lives into the archetype of the farmer. A housewife is good because she lives into the archetype of the housewife, right? But these archetypes live around you, and they live through the stories. They live through things, but you also then encounter a world of meaning. So there's signs and symbols everywhere all around you, right? And as you move forward in the world, we now live in kind of a historical world where the burden of meaning has been placed upon us. So we give the world meaning, we determine what events mean, but meaning is no longer. This is why the idea of, like, in our sort of modern and postmodern world, the idea of natural law is almost laughable, because the world around us doesn't really have meaning, right? So how can you say, well, I can, these truths are self-evident? They were saying the words in some ways, and they were still experiencing a cultural deposit that was left over, but the words themselves didn't mean anything in many ways. Not the way that they did to say somebody who might say something like that in the 800s or the 700s, but they wouldn't necessarily say that because they wouldn't have had to talk about it that way, because the meaning was ever present, and they didn't necessarily have to talk about natural law the way that St. Aquinas did, if that makes sense. So we're just kind of rambling here.
This is the intro this is the teaser to the next episode we do. So let's mark it here. But where can people find your work before we wrap up?
Yeah, so on Twitter, it's @_Kruptos, Kruptos. And my more serious writing is, you can find it at seekingthehiddenthing.com. So it's a Substack, but I've bought my own domain name because it works better for Twitter that way. So seekingthehiddenthing.com. And just as it's written, Seeking the Hidden Thing. And that's where I do. Now it is a paid site. So I give previews and some free articles, but generally like 2-to-1 paid to free. But the current piece that I'm working on that should drop tomorrow or the next day is working on a theology now, or at least towards perhaps a theology of no enemies to the right. So just wading into that minefield, in addition to many of the other things that I've written.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on, Kruptos. It was a pleasure talking about Ellul. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.
Thank you.